Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Dolby Institute podcast. I'm really excited today to be talking about Dolby Vision. We've been talking for the past several weeks with some of the creators of some of your favorite episodic content in terms of sound design and mixing and Dolby Atmos. But Dolby's not just about sound. As many of you know, we also are in the imaging world with Dolby Vision, which is our flavor of HDR. So I'm really pleased, like I said, to be here today with some of the folks who have been bringing Dolby Vision content to you both in the theaters and on streaming platforms and broadcast for home. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Tom Graham, who is our head of Dolby Vision enablement and who is kind of one of the people who has really been doing a lot of industry outreach around Dolby Vision and just has a great expertise in this subject matter. So Tom and the entire team, welcome to the show. I'm really curious to hear what you guys have to say about Dolby Vision today.
Cool. Glenn, super glad to be here. This is really exciting and kind of the inaugural kickoff to talk to some video dudes, right?
That's right.
And we're gonna call this, I guess, Conversations with Colorists. You know, we wanna have really some longer, open, in-depth conversations that really aren't limited by usual sort of short sound bites or timer format. And we want to listen to colorists on their experiences creating and storytelling in this new HDR and wide color gamut format, as well as really their thoughts on utilizing the Dolby Vision tools and workflows. As you mentioned, we'll be covering both cinema and home/mobile tools, workflows, deliverables. You know, we hope that the series is kind of entertaining, educational. We want to share useful knowledge that, you know, other colorists or producers or showrunners or filmmakers who have yet to embark on this exciting journey can find useful. You know, it's, as you mentioned, you know, being in the lockdown and sort of streaming all this amazing content, it's an incredibly exciting time in our industry with so many outlets of great content and the new possibilities of immersive storytelling, long format, short format, documentary. And so, you know, with all that said, we want to get started sort of where all good stories start, at the beginning, of course. And we wanted to do a little background on Dolby's path to really pioneer and birth HDR and PQ, perceptual quantization, into the world. And ultimately what led to Dolby Vision as a format, as an ecosystem. And to do that, this is something I've wanted to do for a long time and super excited that this format gives us the chance to do it, is we're going to meet with three colorists who work at Dolby, and they are part of the ongoing research team and the innovation process that has really produced this amazing ecosystem. They were there really from the beginning. They also have created many of the Dolby Vision grades for big name studio titles and really interesting research projects. So they have some fantastic real world experience and knowledge to share. So, you know, I think that's super exciting and hopefully useful for you. So if you could, why don't I have you guys quickly introduce yourself and maybe share a title or two that you really enjoyed working on to create, you know, the HDR version of that TV show or picture. So take it away, Rick.
Hi, I'm Rick Taylor, senior colorist at Dolby for research. We did a lot of research early on to create HDR and Dolby Vision, and we did all together in the first 2 years of actually turning out product. We did about 100 titles, it's hard to pick one, but I guess one that I took from theater all the way through, maybe a couple of them. One would be Atomic Blonde, which sat with the director at the Vine Theater and graded that, and he loved it, and then we made it for Dolby Vision home distribution, and I can just watch that movie anytime. It's a lot of fun anyway.
Yeah, and it's
in Dolby Vision, it looks really great.
Yeah, it's got such a beautiful color palette and use of color that it's one of my favorites too. So All right, thanks, Rick. Let's go over to Greg Hamlin.
Yeah, hi, I'm Greg Hamlin. I've been at Dolby now for almost 6 years, and I had worked with Rick at a couple of places in town in the past, and he came to be at the point where they were going to start the race to get 100 titles done, and I came aboard to help make that happen. And it was a lot of fun doing the titles for the studios as they came aboard with Dolby Vision. Probably one of the most exciting ones that I worked on was Platoon, because in that case I really found that in PQ and P3 color space we were able to enhance and get a wider range of hues for the greens and the jungle and the war footage of Vietnam and so forth. And it was a bit of a departure from the previously done grade, and we kind of approached Oliver Stone to tell him what we thought we could do and what might be available in PQ and P3, and he was pretty excited about it when he saw it, and so it was a lot of fun to do that, work with him on that.
Yeah, having seen some of your grade on that, I would say too, the really the night footage with some of the explosions and things, the battle scenes at night were just super intense. So I loved it. Thank you. And Shane, over to you.
Hi, I'm Shane Ruggieri. I've been with Dolby since about 2011, and I'm a colorist, producer type person, and I think I'll stay away from the titles and move towards research, which I really focus on. So latest thing that I've done was the Spears and Munsell benchmark DVD disc that really pushes the gamut, Rec 2020. Also, your highest APL and making images that really made you feel like you're standing there to really push televisions to the best that they can potentially show and show where they stop. And that was kind of a fun thing. So, yeah, that's what I do.
That's great. Awesome. And maybe you guys could just talk a little bit about, my experience of joining Dolby and seeing Dolby Vision was just, probably like you, was just so impactful that I just knew this is what I wanted to do and where I wanted to be and talk about and evangelize it. So really, maybe you guys could just share your experiences of maybe the first time you saw HDR and how it involved Dolby, or sort of bringing it to life, birthing HDR.
I'll jump in. I don't mind that. I love telling this story from my side. When I first got to Dolby and asked to come over and start doing some HDR content, they were working on Pulsar. They had a couple other prototype monitors, but they had this one called the P6 Mono, which was a projector shooting down onto an LCD panel, and it was, pushing 20,000 nits. And I remember sitting in front of it, looking at the imagery and just thinking to myself, I can touch that. I can reach through and touch that. It felt so real. And I had only planned on being here a year. That's what I promised the guy who hired me. I said, I'll give you a year, and then I'm going to go out in the world and do this Dolby Vision stuff, right? And that was 9 years ago.
Rick, how about you?
Well, I came in 2012, and we got a Pulsar, one of the original 5. And originally, people were trying to do HDR video in gamma space, and gamma's limited. And one of the things that you have to do is try and stretch it, and it create a lot of noise. And so we had guys working on noise reduction for this, and I started dealing with the images in log space, and then. One day, I had a guy named John McIlvaine, who's one of our physicists, right? Real smart guy, came in and he put PQ, which was called ADM at the time, on the Pulsar, and I was able to start grading images with log tools in PQ, and it just clicked. It was the most amazing image I had ever seen. And so we rapidly started digging things out of the archives, old D21 projects that everyone thought were too noisy to use, and of course, famous fantasy flights which Bill, my boss, kept telling me, go brighter, go brighter. And I'm like, are you sure? Yeah, and he was right. We were able to stretch the boundaries and take images that were shot on Alexa, given all the range that the Alexa would provide, and then put it on this monitor and just make incredible images.
So we'll just define two quick things here that we're going to talk a little bit more about, PQ and pulsar. So PQ stands for perceptual quantizer, and that was essentially, as Rick mentioned, a logarithmic style tone curve for luminance compared to the very linear gamma, which was designed for SDR, for cathode ray tube TV. So basically Dolby, one of the ways Dolby helped bring HDR to life was to say we've got to change the way we work with images, and our eyes work logarithmically. So PQ made a lot of sense, right, Rick?
Correct. And it's also, it's a 10,000 nit container, and there's a definite code value per nit correlation. So it's an easy thing to keep track of. It's very exact if you're looking at it with your scopes. Very predictable.
Cool. And then pulsar we'll talk about more in a minute, but that was the Shane mentioned the first research monitor that was kind of a hybrid projector and an LCD screen. Rick, tell us a little bit about pulsar. What is it? And it's the mysterious unicorn of the video industry, right?
Very. I think they're probably only 20 in existence at this moment. It's a 4,000 nit monitor. It's got really good blacks, not as good as OLED, but it's liquid cooled because it has to be. Yeah, power drops in the vicinity when you turn it on, so it's it's not exactly eco-friendly, but it puts out amazing pictures. The technology is based on our PRM. It's just about 3 times the number of LEDs.
You really couldn't affordably manufacture it to sort of send out in the real world. It's quite a monstrosity with, as you mentioned, 4 power supplies, liquid cooling, weighs 400 pounds, requires several people to move it. So yeah, that's a little bit about pulsar. We can always come back to that. Greg, tell us about your sort of first experience with HDR and how it brought you to Dolby.
Well, when I first came in to talk with Rick and Bill Villarreal about doing HDR and Dolby Vision grading, they ran that exact footage that Rick was talking about grading, the Fantasy Flights footage, which probably most people have seen by now. And it's an aluminum skinned airplane flying around over the Channel Islands, and there's a low sun in the sky, and there's lots of reflections off the water and off the plane. And when I first saw it, I was just blown away. I saw it on the pulsar, and I think some of those highlights do go over 4,000 nits in that clip, and I felt like I was looking out a window. It didn't look like I was looking at a monitor. And even though we're still far from hitting the nit level that you see when you're actually out in the world and looking around, compared to SDR, it just seems so much more realistic, so much more compelling and exciting to see. So I couldn't wait. I was just really keen to start playing in that medium and using that palette.
Yeah. Shane, you too. I mean, it's one of those, I've heard you talk about it many times about how exciting when you saw the possibilities that you said, I've got to get my hands in this, right?
It was. I mean, when you start looking at imagery, and the first time I saw HDR, I think it was at 600 nits, and I still was like, oh, this is it. This is all I need. All I need is 600 nits. This is the end all be all. And then I saw the pulsar at 4,000 nits, and I'm like, wow, okay, okay, now I get it. And one of the things that I tried to do is try to put myself into a place of how do I think about this stuff, and how do I look at the imagery and try to place it in my head, because, 15 years prior to that, I had just been working in the 100 nit realm, and it made me rethink how I thought about just imagery being displayed and telling stories. because the range brought me closer to things I just had no experience with, except for being outside or being in reality. And it confused me. It excited me. It drove me to want to know more and understand it, because I mean, I saw the future there. I knew that was going to be the future. And that's why I took the job number one. And it's why I'm still here, is because it is how you can tell a better story, or a different story. Let's not call it a better story, a different story in a way that you simply couldn't do before. And approach people and craft a reaction from the audience that just simply wasn't possible, other than being right in front of them in real life. And that's what I find so exciting about this, is that you can bring people closer to reality or push them away from reality, just by using light ratios and bringing them close, which you kind of could do it at 100 nits, but nowhere near what you can do at 4,000 or even 10,000 or 20,000 nits. You can really bring people closer and further away, which is, again, another storytelling technique. Cool.
And I hear this occasionally, not so much anymore, but in the beginning, I'm sure you guys sort of heard it all the time, is, I guess, and Shane's already sort of started hitting on it. What does HDR mean to him in storytelling terms, and wide color gamut mean to you? But really, why isn't HDR just a gimmick like 3D? Like what's different that, you could tell people, say you're working with a new filmmaker, like what is it that they should, this isn't just a gimmick. It's just like 3D. It's going to go away. Rick, you want to go first?
Well, it's 3D seems to be artificially immersive, right? It is a gimmick, and you have to wear glasses and all this kind of stuff. When you get to dynamic range, your real world is filled with a greater dynamic range than you'll ever see on a monitor. Mm-hmm. But HDR brings you closer to that reality, and I think it's much more immersive than any other technique. You add to that Atmos sound, and you've got a complete visual and soundscape and complete experience.
It's great. Greg, what's your thoughts on that topic, or how would you talk to a creative?
Well, I think, in terms of like 3D being a gimmicky kind of thing, for one thing is to say you have to involve glasses, and, a lot of people, their vision and their eyes are such that they can't actually see 3D in that technology. And it's always trying to approximate, or manipulate depth and a sense of perspective. Whereas, one of the things that fascinated me about HDR is that really what we've done is gotten displays that now are catching up to what we've always been able to capture in our cameras, even going back to film and motion picture film. We just have never been able to see the dynamic range that our eyes could see, and that the cameras and the medium, the digital cameras and film cameras could capture. So what it gives you is a closer representation of what we see with our eyes, and yet a full range in which we can manipulate that in very creative ways, and to exploit shadows and darkness, or exploit, highlights and brightness, and the same with color saturation and things. So it's just a big, wider box of tools.
Yeah, and Shane, you and I have sort of talked about this before. You almost get that sense when you look at, say, an image on the Pulsar, that there is more depth to the image. I don't want to say that it is 3D, but I've heard customers or people say, "Is that 3D?" Because they're with the extra contrast. Tell us more about why we perceive that depth in the image.
Well, only 2 of the 14 cues that give you depth have to do with the space between your eyes. And things like that. A lot of the other things that give you the sense of depth are contrast sensitivity. Like the bulk of it is contrast sensitivity. And in Dolby Vision and HDR has a much wider contrast. And for me to jump into the depth cues, when you start to see ratios, and not just light ratios, but also the color volume. So when you get all this color volume and you're able to see, slight changes in the color volume, it's like if you draw a circle, for example, and you look on a piece of paper and you draw a circle, okay, you got a circle. Now shade it in. Now you've got a ball, okay, or a sphere. Now, if you imagine coloring that in with a single color crayon, yeah, okay, it takes on more, but now use, 400 crayons and get all the detail in. All of a sudden, all those different shades start to come alive. And that's what you're doing with HDR. And that's what you're doing as you raise color volume, is you're allowing those other colors and those shades of colors to come in that never were there before. And you start to perceive depth. Your eyes really start to see that depth. And I've had those same questions multiple times. Is this 3D? Is this one lenticular lens? It's like, no, man, that's just how your brain starts to interpret. And that's one of the things about this gimmick thing. I relate it back to Atmos. They put Atmos around you so that when you hear a sound over there, you don't have to turn your head. It's right over there, 5 feet away from you. It's coming from that direction. And same thing with vision. We're looking back at the how the eye works. We're looking back at and connecting it to how the ear works. And we're giving the experience not just, oh, this is better. No, we're connecting it to how you work. Your PQ curve is based on the Barton curve, and that's basically how your eye sees. 1 step here, you can't see the difference. 2 steps, you can see the difference. And that's the curve that was created. That's the PQ curve. And so that aligns exactly into your eye.
Another thing that we've often done as we demonstrate the pulsar and, showing someone 4,000 nit, HDR image for the first time, oftentimes they'll say, is this UHD? Is this 4K? And maybe just explain that conversation that you guys have. Shane, go ahead, since you're sort of teed up.
Yeah, I love that conversation because when they come into my demo room and I put 2 images up, in SDR, first I say, hey, look how great this SDR image is, and they're like, wow, that looks great. Put it up on our PRM monitor, and they're loving it. And it's typically the Fantasy Flights content, and they're like, that's beautiful. That's a gorgeous image. And then I turn on the pulsar, and they're like, wow, okay. And I was like, that looks pretty good, right? And they look at the SDR and they're like, what happened? Did you turn it down? It's like, no. I said, and let's talk about 4K. If you had to, you need to be 1.6 screen heights away from 4K. So if you got a 55-inch screen, how close do you have to be to actually see the difference in 4K? I could put a 4K up right where you're looking and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. But I tell you what, why don't you walk across the street over there and you tell me which one is different? Okay, you tell me which SDR or HDR image is different. You can tell from across the street, not 1.6 screen heights away. So it also relates back to the person and how they see and how they relate to reality. People are asking me, why does it look so good? It's like, well, why do we want so much brighter imagery? Well, the answer is because in reality, that's what the light ratios are. You're referring to it back here. In your head, you're seeing something that you've never seen before, but the relationship is already in your head and you're going, that looks more real. Because you've seen a flower in the sun. You've seen these things and it's bringing you closer.
Greg or Rick, you want to jump in on the, I guess it's still on the gimmick situation of why HDR makes a bigger impact than UHD, 4K, or now 8K.
Well, yeah, I would think it is the fact that people can see a huge difference in the image right away. And then, that greater contrast does give you the impression of a greater resolution. So we often, even though we will say to people when they come into the room for a demo that the pulsar is an HDR monitor, when they see it side by side with the PRM and the same image in SDR, they almost always will ask, now, so that's 4K though on the left, isn't it, on the pulsar? And you have to say, no, we haven't, when we built this, we built it as an HDR monitor. So, it is just something that can be seen from any distance. Right away, people get the impact.
There's perceptual. It's the perceptual resolution. So I ask the people when they're doing demos as well is, which one has more detail? I ask them that particular, which one has more detail, the SDR or the HD, pulsar? And they look at it and they're obviously the pulsar. And I said, well, does it? Does it have more detail? It's both 1920, 1080. It's both the same starting content. And they think about it. They're like, well, yes and no. And I say, well, You're actually right. Because we think of detail in terms of pixels, but now there's a perceptual aspect that needs to be taken into account and redefine what detail means.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so Rick, really in the world, this sort of leads to my next question, which is why HDR isn't just about brighter images. Why is it really about contrast and utilizing that depth in ways with highlight detail, shadow detail, and, how would you talk to someone who says, well, 10,000 nits is crazy. Well, I need sunglasses? I mean, that's just insane, right? So how would you have that conversation?
Well, I've had actual colorists come in and say, "Oh, this is too bright." Well, demo content is demo content, and we often scare directors and people like that by showing them the demo first, and then when they come in to see their actual footage, they're like, "Oh, well, this looks great." Yeah, and part of that is trying to say we're not going to break your picture, we're not going to change your picture. We're going to put it in a different space, and you're going to see everything that you recorded. And you can choose not to see that. We can adjust it that way. But it's everything that was captured can be there. And it depends on how you decide to use that as to what the final image is going to look like.
Greg, what's your stories about, working on films with the will I need sunglasses? Why HDR isn't always about bright images?
I think the project that I was involved with that showed that to me most clearly was a picture that Glenn and the Dolby Institute had selected from Sundance to give them a Dolby Cinema grade. And it was Sounds of Silence. Was that the right title, Glenn?
The Sound of Silence. It was a really wonderful little film about a guy who has a very specific quirk in his hearing, his perception. But part of the grant that we gave them allowed them to finish the film in Dolby Atmos and Dolby Vision. And I think sometimes when we bring those young filmmakers in to sit with you guys, it's a little bit of a scary experience because they don't know exactly kind of what to expect. And they've been, this is a really big deal too that we talk about on the sound side. They've been used to looking at their movie a certain way for a very long time, and suddenly they come in and they sit with you and they have a lot of new possibilities. So yeah, this was Sound of Silence was a picture that was directed by Michael Taberski, and I'm curious to hear what went down in the room after I left them.
Well, we'll have to look up. I don't remember the name of the colorist that was working on the show, but. Sometimes we do the grade for folks that come in like that. And other times we'll help them as they do the grade. And we'll sort of give them some tips and pointers on how to place their image within the HDR. Well, there's a scene in the movie that takes place on the rooftops in the middle of New York City at night in a rainstorm with a power out.
During a blackout, right?
Yeah,
it's about as dark as it could possibly be. Yes.
And we have two actors standing on the roof, and they're looking out, and the lights go out on all the buildings. And I teased the colorist because I said, once the lights had gone out, I said, okay, now we've gone from 30 nits down. Oh no, actually it was lower than that. I think we've gone from 8 nits down to 3. Let's go for 2.5, guys. And even though the image, had almost no luminance, you could still see detail. You could still make a distinction between the clouds in the background, the dark shadows on the rooftop, structures, and you could see the actors' faces. And that was when I began to really sort of evangelize with the idea that HDR is not about brighter. It's about this full range and this contrast, and the room to really play with how much detail you want to show.
It's a great story, yeah. Yeah, and I think that leads me to my next question. Now that you've sort of seen the possibilities of HDR and Dolby Vision, and you've lived enough in that world, what frustrates you most about working in SDR Rec 709? The challenges that a colorist has to face on a day-to-day basis in SDR.
I mean, you have all the dynamic range you want. Like Fantasy Flights is a perfect example. It can be 4,000, 10,000 nits in the highlights if you do it in HDR. But you have to leave something behind. If you want to have the clouds in the same shot as the woman in the shadows, you're going to have to do extra work and matte the clouds. You're going to have to pull all that back. So it's a lot of extra work, and you don't always get the luminance ratio that you would in real life, obviously, because you're in a limited range. So all these things are trade-offs in that space.
Having watched you guys work, it seems like there's also a battle for color saturation, right? That you have to how to figure out to place the color versus the chroma versus the luminance, right?
Sure. And when you've got and if you're working in television, you're in Rec 709, which is a more limited space than the cinema space, which is P3. But even then, the color is going to roll off somewhat as you reach the peaks, and that's the way that system works. And with HDR, you're holding on to that color information up into the highlights. It doesn't diminish and it doesn't deviate.
Shane, what were you going to add?
When people talk about, they say things like, oh, I got to wear sunglasses to see that. It's so bright. And it's like, you know what? I said, I love responding to those people. And I asked them straight up, when you go outside and you've got 20,000 nits bouncing off that wall or bouncing off that, and you've got 10,000 nit skin tones and 600 nit shadows, your eyes are working that stuff out, and you're not complaining at that point. When your eyes adapt and you get adjusted to the situation, you're fine. Or when you go to a live performance, let's say a live show or a play, and you've got those lights, swinging into your eyes, and it becomes part of the experience. You're not complaining at that point. It's part of the experience. It's part of that authentic interaction with light that you're having that gives you that feeling and sense. In fact, I was working on a project with Lou Levinson over at Apple. It was the Carrie Underwood, and in the background, she had this massive wall of LEDs. I mean, it filled the whole back of the stage, and there was just monstrous light coming off of those things. And I asked Lou, I said, Lou, before we get going here, before we get grading, he was guiding it and I was pushing the buttons. And I asked him, where do you want to feel like you are when you're watching this? Do you want to feel like you're in the stands, you're right there standing with the audience? Or do you want to feel like you're at home and you're watching it kind of comfortably, kick back on your couch kind of thing? And he says, I want to feel like I'm there, man. I was there, and I know what it felt like to be there. So I want to feel like I was there. So what we did is we took time to really start pushing on those lights, especially that background light. And he was concerned, or one of his concerns was, I don't want to lose detail in the face. I said, okay, and that's, we've got to be, she's the show, she's the artist. We got to make sure we see her. So I said, okay, let's try that. Let's work on that. So we took one shot where it was just, the LEDs were fully lit. And we brought it up, and we were pushing. And I said, well, let me try something for you. And I pushed it all the way up to 4,000 nits. I mean, those lights were just blasting out onto the pulsar. And I said, and he's like, that looks tremendous. He goes, that's starting to make me feel like it was there. So we take that piece of content, right? And we finish it. And I show that content a lot. And when I showed that content to various people, for demonstrations inside, and that's blasting, and you got her sitting in front of it, I asked him, can you see her face? And everybody always shakes their head yes, we can see it. I said, can you see the detail in her skin? Always shakes their head yes. And I said, so that's a 4,000 nit light, and yet inside that 4,000 nit backlight, you can see the details on that person's face, on the skin. So your eye is not blown out. Your eye and your brain work that out, and they work out how to figure out what's important to your eye, and your eye and your brain figures that stuff out. So if someone just, says, oh, you're going to use sunglasses, I just like saying, you know what, you don't know how this thing works. You're just making this up. You're just saying stuff. And you have these real authentic interactions with light. And that's part of the experience of doing HDR, and watching HDR is that authentic experience with light.
That's what I find. I find sort of just watching two different images, the SDR version and the HDR version, I'm definitely more drawn into, my eye has to work more and pay attention more, and it wants to soak in all this great information in the Dolby Vision version, where the SDR one, everything looks very one-dimensional and kind of just all sits there, right?
It's a compromise. Rick said it. It's a compromise all the way through. When you're compromising what was really there to put it into this 100-nit box, that's what SDR has always been. And it's wonderful. We tell wonderful stories at 100 nits. I'm not putting that down. But when you've got a capture that's, 14 stops plus, and you're bringing that image down into a 7.5 stop image, you're throwing half the image away and you're compromising those ratios. And so, if you talk about skies, to get bright blue skies at 100 nits, you get 7 nits of blue. Out of 100 nits, you get 7 nits of pure blue. This is an additive color space, right? Television's an additive color space. And so you're not going to get a deep saturated bright sky. You can get a deep saturated sky, but it's going to be at, not very, very bright. So if you want a bright sky, you're going to have a desaturated sky. It adds up. RGB add up to white. So the brighter you go from 7 nits, well, if you go, that's it. Everything above that, you're desaturating. Now, if you want to look at HDR and 10,000 nits on a 10,000 nit system, you got 300 nits of pure blue. 300. So 3 times the 100 nit 709, you get 300 nits of pure blue. So in HDR, you can have really deep saturated colors. That's not just goes for blue, it goes for red, green, and blue, right? You've got really deep saturated colors to really bring content to life.
Greg, tell us most what sort of, since your eyes have been open, what frustrates you about the SDR Rec 709 world?
Well, here's the thing. I feel as though I've been very fortunate that in the last 6 years, I've done very little SDR first color correction. So what I feel is the other side of that coin. When I am working on the derived SDR based on the HDR grade I've done, I am delighted by what is available there. So as Shane says, those deep blue skies are still deep blue, even though they may be approaching 100% luminance level in 709. But I wanted to respond to something that Shane said earlier about when you had said to Lou Levinson, do you want to feel like you're sitting on the couch watching this concert on your TV, or do you want to feel like you're there? Often we're asked by people, how do you figure out where to put the image? And I began early on because often we were starting with something that had been done as an SDR grade. And we're asked now to do the HDR Dolby Vision version. And I would think to myself, how bright should this be? How far should I take this? And I would often just say, well, imagine I'm there at that location, or I'm on that set. I'm on that, staircase outside a fire escape on a nighttime, whatever. And I would just say, how would I expect it to look if I was there? And that was when I would begin to play with opening up shadows or bringing up highlights and, letting spectral highlights go quite bright or whatever. And when it felt natural in that way, that's when I felt I was getting, in the ballpark, in the right place.
Cool. I think we'll dive deeper into the topics of where and how you guys do what you do, maybe in the next podcast. But it's definitely a good point. Let's transition a little bit to sort of talk about the technical pieces of Dolby Vision, and we'll start since we've been talking mostly about home. Maybe you guys could just explain in layman's terms, as if your director or your producers were walking in, what was the reason for Dolby Vision dynamic metadata? Why was that invented? And what's the need for it? Maybe you could take us through that. Rick, I'll have you go first.
Oh, thanks. The dynamic metadata looks at, we generally do this shot by shot rather than frame by frame. But you'll look at all of the luminance values within a shot and optimize that. So it's really an optimization of the image to utilize the dynamic range that's in that image to its fullest extent. And a lot of colorists think that they have to grade that out. It's like so what they really want is static metadata, and if it's kind of probably more a psychological thing than it is an actual thing. Dynamic metadata won't change things drastically shot to shot. Mm-hmm. However, if you have something like a big bright window behind somebody, mm-hmm. It will necessarily make certain things darker that you probably don't want dark, like the face. So the solution is to do something like take the analysis from the two shot, put it on the close up, and then it falls right in.
So, but the purpose really was to help translate these images that you're creating to all the different TVs out there on the market, right? And you're sort of helping guide that shot-by-shot metadata and confirming how the mapping will occur.
Right, and you're doing it on a graded image, right? So it's not like you're using it on raw data and you have to grade it as such with dynamic metadata, because mm-hmm. that would be completely ridiculous. Yeah. So you've got a graded image and it has a look, and the dynamic metadata looks at all those images, and it flows along.
Greg, tell us your thoughts about why the Dolby Vision dynamic metadata is important, and sort of your feelings about it.
Sure. So, for years we were all grading to a standardized professional grading monitor. The spec for it in terms of brightness, contrast, and how much color and everything was established, and everyone
in SDR
met that. Yeah, in SDR. And television manufacturers were all trying to build TVs that fell close to or within that spec, right? And now, you would do a session in a color grading suite and have to remind everybody, this isn't going to look exactly the same anywhere else, except another post house that has this same monitor that's been calibrated. Well, that became the Wild West when we got to HDR, and TV manufacturers were making TVs with all different varying brightness levels and capabilities. And so the question was, how do we, maintain that artistic integrity of the approved color grade that's been done in HDR, and have the best representation of that in all these different devices with all their range of capability of brightness. So, the analysis, the Dolby Vision analysis of the image, the remapping to 70900 nits, and then any trims or adjustments that colorists want to do to refine that, is then used to reproduce the best image on either an SDR monitor or an HDR TV that has 300 nits, 600 nits, whatever the maximum brightness they can achieve. So that's its purpose, and it was meant to try to preserve the artistic creative intent on all displays.
Dynamic metadata is meant to give you control. It's there to help you take a 4,000 nit or even 1,000 nit mastered set of images and map them down to 100 nits, and then best to be able to tell that story at that 100 nits. So, there's no expectation in my mind that the 1,000 nit or even the 4,000 nit mastered images are going to be identical to the 100 nit images that you've created, unless you've graded the whole 4,000 nit, master image down to 100 nits, and it's, a 1-to-1. So the question comes up of how do you best tell that story at 100 nits? And that's what the metadata is there for. The dynamic metadata is there for. So one set of LUTs to map, or one set of metadata to map from 4,000 nits or 1,000 nits down to 100. And you've got, shot to shot, you've got varying degrees of luminance and color and saturation. One set of LUTs is not going to do it. One set of metadata is not going to do it. Imagine if you're really using the 1,000 or the 4,000 nit HDR to tell stories, to pull the eye around, to get engaged with authentic interactions with light. And that's not going to happen the same way at 100 nits as it does at 4,000. So how do you take that story and map it down? The director has a choice there, right? They have a choice at that point because they're the ones looking at both images, the 100 nit and the 4,000. People at home aren't looking at both sides of that. They see one representation of it, and our job as storytellers is to give them that story at that performance level and make sure they have that engaging experience. And those things that you can engage with, those tools that you can engage with and use as a storyteller are different at 4,000 nits, 1,000 nits, and 100 nits. The dynamic metadata is there to help you balance those things and best tell that story at the various performance tiers.
Yeah, I love that you brought up the idea of LUTs. You really couldn't do it with LUTs. And the Dolby Vision dynamic tool set, that we'll dive into that in the next episode, but really they give you these really usable controls that allow you to manipulate and bend that dynamic metadata and really maintain the look that you want across a wide variety of devices, right?
You're right. It's the best thing that you can do and use to tell the story at these different performance tiers. I don't want to say maintain a look. I like to describe it as, at this performance tier, how do I tell this story utilizing all the tools and the capabilities I can at this level? At 4,000 nits, you're going to have a certain level of tools and certain sets of tools that you can use to interact with the audience. At 1,000 nits, those are going to be slightly different. There's less luminance. There's less color. There's less interactive. Your eye has to do less things as you go from dark to light, those kind of interactions, and some of the other interactions that you get from the eye, physical interactions, movements, that kind of thing. And how do you best tell that story and get that impact at 100 nits? And how do you do that? How do you map that down?
Yeah. Just to add to that, early on, obviously we didn't have this system, right? We tested almost everything with static LUTs, and what you got back was not exactly what you wanted when you tried to map down to Rec 709 or to 600 PQ. The decision was made to do dynamic metadata just because a static LUT doesn't give you the best image possible.
You know, we focus a lot on the home deliverables creation for home televisions and mobile phones and such. Let's just shift a little bit and talk about the Dolby Cinema experience and really the Dolby Vision projector and creating content. Now, you guys all have experience in that realm as well. What makes the cinema experience similar and different? Rick, I'll throw it to you first.
Well, obviously, you've got the same 1,000,000-to-1 contrast ratio that you know, in what is 19 stops that you have with the Pulsar, but it's only 108 nits, and you'd think that would be a problem, but it's not. On a large projected image like that, and I think that we're talking about 65 feet for our most of our Dolby Cinemas. It looks absolutely amazing. Again, it's the contrast and not the brightness, but the detail and particularly you know, we were talking about 3D earlier in terms of being a gimmick. When you look at Dolby Vision 3D, which is 48 nits per eye, it looks absolutely amazing too. It's a completely different experience from the DCI experience.
So 108 nits, and it's because it's a very, very dark room, you still have that ability to go down into the lower nit values like Greg was talking about on his earlier show. Greg, I'll kick it to you. Talk a little bit about how the laser primaries and the technology gives you an extended color gamut, a really wide color gamut that's capable for amazing things with animation, right?
Yeah, I think in animation, people tend to really push colors and do some really extreme kind of hues and make it pretty spectacular looking. And on the Dolby projector, it's just extraordinary. I know Rick has done some work with Pixar, haven't you, Rick, or DreamWorks? Who was it?
I did work with Warner Brothers. We did a wide color gamut version of Lego Batman, which was stunning.
Yeah, some amazing orange and green skies for sure.
And then I had the pleasure of working on the Dolby Cinema version of Trolls 2, which kind of famously did not make it to the cinema because we had the lockdown.
COVID-19, baby.
Yeah, but I can tell you, it looks wonderful. It looks brilliant on that projector.
And Shane, tell us how it's different than the home version in that you don't, quote unquote, need dynamic metadata, right?
No, you don't need dynamic data because you're actually grading right on the projector itself. And the projector is pushing the image right to the screen. And so you're really getting a one-to-one experience from the projector to the viewing experience. So what the colorist and the producers and the directors and whoever's in control of that image are seeing in the theater, that's what the audience gets to experience.
Mm-hmm. And if you were to start with, say, a Dolby Cinema version, does that project then translate to go start the Dolby Vision home version, say for 1,000 nits or 4,000 nits?
It can. I mean, I did that with Pan. Pan was done in London, and I ended up doing the video part of it, and it translates really easily. Actually, when you're in PQ, it's easy to scale to the different luminance that the pulsar provides.
Mm-hmm. So it's a matter of sort of shifting where that dynamic range sits for the playback device, right? Yeah.
And not necessarily just shifting. It's not just shifting. It's about also recurving that into the dynamic. It's not just a shift. It's not just a lift. You actually have the range and the handles, if you will, the scale to then place that into the EOTF, bend that EOTF to then give the best representation in a home display.
Great. That's why they pay you guys to be the colorist and me just to be the evangelist. So maybe just as we finish up, you guys could talk about a lot of your day-to-day work that you do now. As the ecosystem has been more enabled, there's more post houses and colorists. You guys, in the early days, you were doing some of these titles to help kickstart the ecosystem. Tell us more about your daily work now in designing the algorithms and, the integration into color correctors and the testing, the things that you do. If you could, just give us what does a day in a life of Rick, Shane, and Greg look like?
Well, actually, that began even during our race to 100 titles, because what we found was every now and then you'd have a shot that you would run the analysis on, and no matter what you did with the trims, you couldn't get the image you wanted in the Drive 709. And we would immediately grab a still of any of those shots. We called them the outliers. And Rick began to build a library of those that we then could work with the Dolby engineers to say, these are shots where the analysis and the trims don't work. What can we do to improve that? Rick, you could talk more about that.
That's a great point. So you guys look at thousands and thousands of different images, right, Rick?
Yes, and it never ends. There's always something that's going to trip up a system, and so we went from version 2.9 to version 4.0, and a lot of that was looking at these outliers and understanding where things needed to be improved, and so that's every day for us.
That's great. So it's really you guys spend a lot of time with colorists and other people looking at their images and maybe trying to help them through the challenges that they're finding and ways to go. So that's great. Shane, how about you? What's a lot of the research work that, you can't talk about the undercover secret stuff, but what's your day like?
So I work really closely with the AVC, the Advanced Visual Science team, and the Advanced Visual Science team are really testing algorithms. They're testing. They also have where we get partner products in, so monitors, that type of thing. And we've even back in the day we were testing our own monitors, and we would run those through the gauntlet of visual stimulus, visual acuity, and visual tests. Also just performance tests. And so my day could start off with, running test patterns on monitors to see where they fall apart or where they're not, where the algorithm isn't quite working. Then it goes to a grading in the afternoon so that we can push a certain aspect of what HDR does and really pushing those. Then it can go to going and taking a visual test by one of the neuroscientists, which I love to break their tests because apparently I have pretty good color vision and, I like to break their bell curves. And also then getting pulled into, questions about, would this tool work? They've got the math, but then they want to put it inside a color corrector and it's like, no one will ever use that tool. Like, that's not, no. If you thought about it like this, maybe we might use it. And so, we're being used to kind of bridge the technical and the creative communities. And because we've got a very vast experience grading content and having technical conversations, it allows us to then kind of interpret and go back and forth and maybe make some suggestions or at least give some critical thinking points to the scientists and the community.
And I think that's a great place to end, really, is that, having you guys in-house, essentially making the tools better, making the algorithms better, making the workflow easier to use and help really answer it from the creative control side of things, I think is just a fantastic benefit for Dolby and ultimately the community. So I think we should dive in next time into deeper conversations about some of the things that you've learned using the tools and the workflow. So stay tuned for part 2, coming soon to a theater near you. Rick, Greg, Shane, Glenn, come on, it was pretty cool, right? Video guys, we can geek out too, right?
That's right.
Well, Tom, thanks for hosting this session, and everybody, thanks for tuning in. This has been a really interesting conversation about Dolby Vision, and as Tom said, we hope that it's going to be the start of a series of conversations, not only internally about the tools and the technology, but also with colorists and hopefully with some filmmakers and artists who are using the technology to tell their stories and let them tell you a little bit about what they're doing from a creative standpoint. So thanks everybody for tuning in. This is Glenn Kaiser from the Dolby Institute signing off. Talk to you next time. Bye-bye.